I still remember the cold sting of the wind that whipped across the dock in Hamburg, as if it had one last thing to say before I left everything behind. My coat, worn thin and patched at the elbows, was no match for the salt-soaked air rolling in from the Atlantic. Around me, a sea of weary faces, some with tear-streaked cheeks pressed to loved ones' shoulders, others already looking past the horizon with silent resolve. The ship towered above us like a rusted cathedral, its hull streaked with decades of crossings and secrets. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath layers of hunger, nervousness, and the vague scent of cabbage and coal smoke, sat the quiet throb of hope. Boarding was neither graceful nor kind. Each passenger was funneled up narrow gangways, clutching threadbare bags and bundles, children wrapped in scarves like makeshift cradles. The crew barked orders in broken phrases, mixing German, Yiddish, Polish, and English in a way that made no one feel understood. I kept my head down, repeated the name Johann over and over again, my father's name, the name I would give them at Ellis Island. Mine, too dangerous, too foreign, too complicated for their forms. The ship's belly was dark and damp. Steerage smelled like wet rope, boiled potatoes, and too many people packed too close. The walls dripped with condensation. There were rows of hammocks and iron bunks, stacked 3 high, each one narrower than a coffin. I claimed a middle bunk beside a boy who refused to speak, and an old woman who prayed silently into her hands each night. Privacy evaporated like breath on cold glass. The first night, I barely slept. The engines roared through the hull like distant thunder, a reminder that we were now separated from the old world by miles of black churning sea. Babies cried. Someone coughed, always coughing. And in the still moments between waves, you could hear prayers, whispers, even the occasional argument break out over food or space. I clutched the small pouch sewn into my waistband. Inside, a lock of my mother's hair and a crumpled letter from my cousin in New York. My last anchors. As the days stretched on, time grew shapeless. Meals were served at irregular intervals. Thin broth, bread when available, sometimes a slice of cheese if the crew was in a good mood. Water tasted like rust. Rats darted across the lower decks without shame. Above, second and first class passengers walked open-air promenades and sipped tea with sugar. We were not allowed there, not even for air. Still, hope stirred. Stories were shared in huddles, tales of jobs that paid in dollars, streets paved with something better than mud. A man with a glass eye told me he had family in Chicago who owned a bakery. A young woman said she would be a seamstress on Fifth Avenue. I said little. I didn't yet know what I would be. All I knew was that it had to be better than what I left behind. Some days brought storms. Waves slammed the hull so hard it felt like the ship might split open. Buckets were passed around for those too sick to move. We swayed in our beds, praying not to fall. I lost count of how many vomited into the corridors, how many stayed silent and pale afterward, wrapped in blankets and silence. One man died in his sleep, his body wrapped in canvas and taken somewhere above. No one said a word. Yet even on the most miserable days, we clung to the idea that we were going somewhere, that this voyage was the price of a new beginning, that maybe, just maybe, we'd be the ones who made it. There was something almost holy about the shared suffering, a whispered contract between strangers. If we make it, we remember each other. Then, on the 11th morning, it happened. A buzz rose through the decks like an electrical current. Someone had seen land. People surged to the upper deck, tripping over one another for a glimpse. I pushed past shoulders, ducked under elbows, and craned my neck skyward. And there she was, partly obscured by mist, yet unmistakable. The Statue of Liberty. She wasn't as tall as I imagined, but I was there, torch raised against the morning fog, as if keeping vigil over the tired and the filthy. Someone began to cry. Others crossed themselves. I just stood there, unsure whether to believe that she was real, that this strange woman made of copper, with her stern face and stone gown, might welcome me. But welcome was a relative term. What came next would decide everything. We weren't there yet. Ellis Island still waited. Its halls, its questions, its judgments. The tests had not yet begun. And as the ship creaked forward toward the harbor, past gulls and barges and the metallic sprawl of New York, I realized that a journey wasn't ending. It was just shifting. The real test of survival was about to begin. I didn't expect the line to feel so permanent. We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, pressed together like pages in a book left out in the rain, creased, damp, and clinging. The dock had been chaos, but this was order disguised as mercy. Ropes guided us forward like cattle chutes, and at the end of the pier, Ellis Island loomed with red brick buildings, arched windows, and a dome that looked almost sacred, if you didn't know better. The air smelled of seaweed, sweat, and something chemical. Every few minutes, a name was called and someone was whisked away. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they didn't. No one said where they went. That mystery grew heavier with each step toward the inspection hall. Mothers gripped children tightly. Men with bandaged hands stood with quiet determination. No one looked directly at the guards. Inside, the registry room was even more overwhelming. It was vast, an echoing cathedral of bureaucracy. Tall ceilings, rows of benches, and immigration officers with starched collars and cold stares. There were doctors, too, weaving through the crowd like hawks scanning for weakness. They used a button hook to flip open your eyelid, searching for signs of trachoma. If you flinched or blinked too much, they marked your coat with chalk. A letter, a code, a warning. I saw it happen. A woman ahead of me, tall with auburn braids and a child strapped to her chest, was marked with an H, hernia, they said. She tried to protest, but they didn't listen. She was led away through a side door. Her child cried. She didn't come back. When my turn came, I tried to make myself smaller. Eyes forward, hands steady. No limp, no cough, no panic. The button hook dug under my eyelid. I didn't flinch. The doctor moved on. My heart pounded so hard, I thought my shirt might pulse with it. Then came the inspectors at the long tables. They asked my name. Johann, I said again. They asked how much money I had. I lied and said $20. I showed them the crumpled $5 hidden in my waistband. The officer squinted but nodded. I was told to move along. All around me, decisions were being made in seconds. Pass, hold, deny. Language barriers turned simple questions into judgment calls. Did he misunderstand, or did he lie? Is she deaf or just confused? A stammer could end you. A cough could exile you. The line between freedom and deportation was thinner than thread. And yet, there was something quietly beautiful too. A mosaic of faces. Italian, Russian, Irish, Armenian, Greek. All chasing some version of the same dream. We weren't just immigrants. We were wagers. Bets cast across an ocean, hoping we'd land heads up in a place that spoke neither our language nor our customs. But maybe, just maybe, our names would echo here someday. I saw a boy my age, perhaps 13, grin as he was told to move on. His shoes were held together with twine. Behind him, an old man crossed himself 3 times and kissed a coin. A woman kissed the Ellis Island floor when she was cleared. I didn't cry, but my knees nearly gave out when I heard the final word from the inspector. Go. I stumbled through the last gate, blinking at the light. There it was, New York Harbor, steel and stone, shimmering like something out of myth. The land of opportunity, the land of survival. And now, it was mine to try. But I'd already learned something. The greatest trials were not always marked by chalk or guarded by uniformed men. Sometimes, the hardest part was simply enduring the waiting, the judgment, and the quiet feeling that you didn't quite belong. Not yet. The echo of boots against tiled floors bounces from every wall as you're funneled into a long, sterile corridor. The line of bodies sways with fatigue, eyes dull with a mixture of fear and determination. You haven't spoken for hours. No one has. Conversations dried up the moment you saw the uniforms ahead. White coats and armbands, their posture as rigid as their procedures. This is the part no one prepared you for. Not truly. You shuffle closer to a table where a man sits, scanning faces like they're livestock. Beside him, another points, directing newcomers towards separate partitions. You're motioned to the left. A gate clicks shut behind you. The man doesn't look you in the eye. Jacket off. Shoes too. You obey. You stand barefoot on the cold tile, fingers nervously gripping your elbow. A doctor walks up, wordless, eyes scanning you. He gestures for you to tilt your head back. Then, without warning, his thumb pulls down your eyelid. He stares into your eye. Too long, too close. Trachoma he's looking for. But you don't know the name of the disease, only that others who had it were taken away. You heard one woman on the ship lost her daughter this way. No warning, no explanation. Next comes a hand to your scalp, a probe behind your ear, a flashlight in your throat. You're told to cough, to squat, to walk in a straight line. Another man scribbles something on a clipboard. You try to read his face, but his expression gives away nothing. Just the rhythm of repetition, of dozens of inspections before you, and hundreds still to come. To the right, a man is marked with chalk, a white X on the shoulder of his coat. No one explains what it means, but the way he's pulled aside is answer enough. Another is told to wait. He nods, trembling. You don't know his language, but fear is fluent in any tongue. Your own turn continues. You feel as if every breath is being judged, like even your silence is being weighed. At one point, the doctor frowns. He lifts your hand and examines the way your fingers tremble. You're not sick, just cold, just scared. But that doesn't matter here. Behind you, a child begins crying. His mother tries to hush him, but it's too late. The noise draws attention. An officer steps forward. She explains that he's just tired, that they've traveled so far. The officer doesn't respond. He only stares. Then he makes a note. Minutes pass, or maybe longer. Time has folded in on itself. But eventually, you're handed your coat and motioned toward another hallway. No chalk mark. No questions. Just the flick of a wrist and you're allowed to pass. Relief floods through you. But it's a dangerous kind of relief. The kind that's too fragile to trust. You walk slowly, expecting someone to call you back. In the waiting room, you see familiar faces missing. people you stood beside on the boat. Gone now. Some for a second inspection. Some you suspect sent back entirely. You sit, but not in comfort. The bench is wooden and narrow. The air is tight with breath and anxiety. A woman beside you crosses herself and whispers something into her cupped hands. You don't pray, but you close your eyes anyway. You realize now that this was never just a health check. It was a sorting, deciding who gets to start a new life and who doesn't even get the chance. A bell rings in the distance. A door opens. You're ushered onward once more. And so you rise, not because you feel ready, but because you must. I hadn't even caught my breath from the medical inspection when we were corralled into yet another hall, this one lined with desks, each with a uniformed official seated behind it, like a judge in some endless courtroom. The windows were high and narrow, letting in beams of dusty light that fell in long, pale rectangles across the worn wooden floor. The smell of ink and sweat hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint creak of shoes and murmurs in countless tongues. This was the legal interview room, though it felt more like a final judgment than any conversation. They pointed at me and gestured toward an open chair in front of one of the desks. I approached slowly, heart beating like a drum. A man with a trimmed mustache and dark eyes waited there, holding a thick clipboard. He didn't look up right away. He simply asked my name without warmth, scribbling something as I gave it. His accent was different than mine, sharper, and I had to strain to catch the meaning behind his words. Every question felt like a test, like a trap with the wrong answer, just waiting to snap shut around me. Where are you from? Who paid for your ticket? Do you have any relatives in America? Are you planning to find work? What kind? Each inquiry came fast and flat, with no space for hesitation, no kindness in the delivery. I did my best to answer truthfully, though part of me wondered if honesty would help or hurt. My village didn't teach us how to navigate foreign bureaucracy, only how to survive the winter and bury our dead. When I said I had an uncle in Chicago, the official narrowed his eyes and asked me to spell his name. I stumbled over the letters, unsure if he'd even recognize them in my tongue. He jotted something, then asked for my age, my religion, if I had ever been in prison, if I was an anarchist. That word I didn't understand. I simply said no. It felt safest. Behind me, someone burst into tears. Maybe they'd been denied. Maybe they hadn't understood the question. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the decision had already been made before they ever stepped off the ship. The official stood abruptly and walked away without a word. I didn't know if the interview was over or if I had failed in some way. I sat there, unsure, trying to keep still, trying not to look frightened. Eventually, a younger man came by and handed me a small card with a number on it. "Go to the right," he muttered. No explanation, just a direction. But it meant I could stand up. It meant I hadn't been taken aside. Not yet. As I moved past the rows of desks, I saw others still seated, still facing that cold interrogation. Some looked confused, others angry, and a few just sat blankly, like the life had been drained out of them by the sheer effort of trying to be understood. I couldn't help but think of the old stories back home, of kings and judges who decided fates with a flick of the wrist. This place was no different, except the robes were replaced with uniforms and the scrolls with paper forms. I followed the painted arrow down the hall toward another room whose purpose I didn't yet understand, but each step forward felt like a quiet victory. I wasn't safe, not by any means, but I was still moving, and that, in this place, meant everything. As the door closed behind me, I glanced back one last time. The interview hall, with its flickering lights and rows of seated souls, faded from view. Ahead, I could hear the shuffling of feet and the low thrum of voices. There was always another room, another test. But for now, I had made it one step further into the unknown. They told me to wait. Just wait. I was led down a dim corridor by a man who didn't speak, only pointed, his boots clacking rhythmically on the stone floor. The air grew colder with each step, and my stomach, already half empty since the ship, sank deeper with dread. This part of Ellis Island felt different, less like a gateway and more like a holding pen. The walls were bare, the ceilings lower. The sounds from the grand hall were muffled now, distant echoes behind stone and doors. He opened a door and motioned for me to enter. Inside was a long, narrow room with wooden benches bolted to the floor. A few men and women sat scattered across them, quiet, hunched, their eyes darting to the door with every creak. Some held bags or papers in their laps. Others just sat still, like statues, as if trying not to be seen at all. No one smiled. No one spoke. I took a seat at the far end, beside a woman with red, cracked hands and a kerchief tied tightly around her head. She didn't look at me. No one did. It was as if we'd all silently agreed that eye contact could get us sent back across the ocean. The minutes passed like hours. There was no clock in the room, no way to tell how long I'd been there. Time dripped by like water from a leaky pipe, slow and relentless. I tried to piece together why I was here. Had I answered something wrong in the interview? Was it my shoes, still muddy from the port? Was it the way I hesitated when they asked if I had a job waiting? I began to think back to the ship crossing. A boy from Naples had told me stories about people being detained for days, sometimes weeks. He said there were beds, sometimes not. He said you could be fed, or you could be forgotten. No rules, no warnings, just waiting, and then maybe a decision you never understood. A child began to cry on the far bench. His mother rocked him gently, her shawl wrapped around them both like a net holding them together. I remember the way she stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, as if willing the bricks to crack open and let her out. The boy's sobs echoed softly in the quiet, a lullaby of uncertainty. Now and then, a name would be called. Sometimes the person would leave, and we'd never see them again. Sometimes they'd return, face pale, and whisper to their neighbor in a language I didn't recognize. Once, 2 guards came in and led a man out by the elbows. He didn't resist, but he didn't walk either. His feet dragged across the floor like he was already halfway back to the old country. I thought about my village, about my mother's hands, calloused from kneading bread. I thought about the neighbor who sold his cow to buy his son's passage to America. I thought about the man on the ship who had died 2 days before we docked and been dropped into the sea like luggage. All of us had risked everything. But now, here in this holding room, it seemed like none of it mattered. All that counted was a form, a stamp, a glance from a man with a badge. I rested my head against the wall. It was cool, almost soothing. Somewhere beyond this room, New York City glittered with the promise of labor and light, and maybe a cot in a boarding house. But from where I sat, it felt as distant as the moon. After some time, maybe hours, maybe only minutes, the door opened again. My name was called. I stood too quickly, my legs wobbling from stillness. A guard motioned for me to follow. I didn't know what the next room would hold. More questions. A bed? A boat ticket home? But as I stepped into the hallway, I told myself one thing over and over in my mind, like a prayer I didn't fully believe. Keep walking. They brought me into a room that smelled like ink, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. It wasn't the courtroom I imagined from the stories back home, with towering ceilings and polished wood. This was smaller, squared off. A single desk at the center. A man sat behind it, leafing through papers with disinterest, his tie slightly crooked, a coffee stain on his shirt collar. Two other officials stood nearby, some arms crossed, faces unreadable. There was no jury, no flag, no gavel, just a clipboard, a sigh, and the weight of a decision already leaning in one direction. They didn't ask for my name. Instead, the man behind the desk cleared his throat and said, "You were held due to concerns about employment and health status. Is that correct?" I nodded. My voice failed me. He kept reading. "You stated that your cousin will support you in New Jersey. There's no letter of affidavit, no address provided." That was true. We had planned to write the address down, but the ship's deck had been too wet, my hands too shaky, and my cousin's English too uncertain to spell it properly. We'd hoped the officials would understand, but understanding wasn't part of this process. "Do you have any funds at all?" he asked. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small pouch. A few coins clinked together inside. I placed them on the desk with both hands, like an offering. He didn't touch them. "No family in the city. No job already arranged." "No, sir," I whispered. He looked up at me for the first time, his eyes scanning not my papers, but my posture, my clothes, my silence. His expression didn't change, but I could feel something calcifying behind it. He wasn't looking for my truth. He was weighing risk. One of the other men spoke now. "We've had 5 turnarounds today. He could be 6. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I heard turnaround and felt the weight of the Atlantic tighten around my chest. My pulse thudded in my ears. The man at the desk exhaled, leaned back, and rubbed his eyes. "You're not sick," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "No visible ailments, just poor, underprepared." He turned to the others. "Give him 1 more day in the dormitory. If his cousin doesn't come forward, we put him on the return list." That was it. No verdict, no signature, just a sentence tossed into the room like trash. They escorted me out without another word. No one explained where the dormitory was. No one said when the cousin needed to appear. Just 1 more day, 24 hours to prove my worth or vanish. As we stepped into the hallway, I caught a glimpse through a nearby window. Outside, the harbor shimmered with light. Ships moved in and out like restless dreams. Somewhere beyond that, just a few miles, but an impossible distance, was a city I'd seen only on maps and in stories. Skyscrapers and sidewalks, newspapers and factory whistles. But here, the ground felt heavy, like it might collapse under the weight of all the silent decisions being made inside these walls. I thought about the man in the waiting room who had vanished, the boy who coughed into his sleeve, the girl whose eyes stayed fixed on the floor. None of us had planned for this. We had come for work, for bread, for freedom, and instead we were measured like cattle. We were statistics scribbled in pencil, easily erased. The guard opened another door. A large windowless room waited inside, lined with narrow beds and thin blankets. The dormitory. I was told to choose any bunk. The air was thick with sweat and desperation. A few men lay on their sides, shoes still on, eyes wide open. No one spoke, not even a whisper. The silence wasn't just fear, it was reverence, like we were attending the slow funeral of our own hopes. I lay down and faced the wall. Tomorrow, my cousin would have to find me, or I would board a ship again, back across the ocean, back into silence, back into the waiting. I awoke with a start, heart pounding as if I'd been running. But I hadn't moved. I was still in the same narrow bed in the dim dormitory. The blanket had slipped to the floor sometime in the night. My breath clouded in the cold air, even though it was summer outside. Inside these walls, the season didn't matter. A bell rang. Not sharply, not urgently. Just enough to remind us that time was moving forward whether we wanted it to or not. A guard entered, muttered something in English none of us understood, and gestured vaguely toward the hallway. We obeyed. The morning was quiet, that kind of fragile quiet that makes every sound feel louder. I walked past the same corridor I'd entered 2 days ago. Same floorboards, same cracked tiles, same faces, though some had changed. A few bunks were empty now, their occupants either approved or sent away. I didn't know which. Breakfast was a bowl of thin porridge and a hard roll. I chewed it slowly, more to pass the time than out of hunger. Every bite was just a reminder of the minutes slipping away. I didn't know where to wait. No one gave instructions. There was no sign saying, "If your cousin is coming, stand here." So I wandered, loitered near windows, looked for anything familiar, but nothing looked like home. Around noon, a man near the door began shouting in Italian. A younger man, his son perhaps, had appeared through the glass, waving frantically at the guards. They embraced through the bars. There was laughter, even some clapping, a reunion, a rescue. I backed away before I could feel too much. My cousin had never promised to come. He'd said maybe. He had a job in Patterson. Long hours. He didn't know when he'd be free. I tried not to blame him. I knew what survival looked like. You couldn't always drop everything for family. Not in this country. By late afternoon, the waiting room began to thin out. More approvals, more turnarounds, more silence. And then, finally, they called my name. Only they didn't say it correctly. They twisted it into something brittle and unfamiliar. But I recognized the shape of it in the sound. I stood quickly. The guard pointed. Interview again. Back to the same room. Same crooked tie. Same desk. This time the man behind it looked more tired than before. His fingers tapped restlessly on the file. He didn't speak for a while. Finally he asked, "Has anyone come for you?" I shook my head. "No letter?" Another shake. He sighed and scribbled something. "Return list," he muttered. "Please," I said. The word came from somewhere deep, cracked and uncertain. "I can work. I will go anywhere." He didn't look up. "Not my decision," he said flatly. I don't remember leaving the room. Only the blur of walls and footsteps. I don't even remember crying, though I must have, because my shirt collar was damp. That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk, shoe still on, and stared at the floor. I imagined the ship again. The steel hull, the endless water. I imagined my mother's hands pressing mine before I left, telling me to write often to come back rich. But what could I write now? Evening settled around us. No one spoke. We were shadows pretending to be men. Suddenly, a guard entered, shouted a name I didn't recognize. Then another, then mine. I froze. He waved me forward. "Your cousin's here." I thought I'd misheard. My legs refused to move, but he said it again, this time louder. I ran, down the hall, past the tiled floor, around the corner, and there he was, leaning against the wall, tired and scruffy, but grinning. "I made it," he said. I brought the letter. He held up a torn envelope, its edges wrinkled from sweat and panic. I had to find a priest who could vouch for me. Took me all day. I couldn't speak. He laughed, pulled me into a rough hug. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here." They let us through. No ceremony, no speech, just the opening of a gate. Outside, the air was different. It smelled of salt and gasoline and something sweet from a bakery down the road. The sun was setting over the harbor, casting everything in gold. I had survived. Barely. But I had made it past the gate. And for the first time in days, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this place really could become home. Stepping off the ferry from Ellis Island onto the bustling streets of Manhattan felt like passing through a hidden curtain, an invisible veil separating one reality from another. Behind me, fear, inspection, confinement. Ahead of me, noise, motion, and a city that pulsed like a living creature. My cousin walked fast. He was taller than I remembered from childhood stories, leaner too. Life in America had trimmed the softness from his features. He weaved through carts, horses, men shouting in a dozen languages. He barely noticed the chaos. I, on the other hand, felt like I'd stepped into a waking dream. Everything was loud. Wheels clattered over cobblestones. Newspaper boys cried out headlines I couldn't understand. Steam billowed from grates in the ground. A brass band played somewhere I couldn't see. It was all so much, so sudden, like falling headfirst into a painting that refused to stand still. We turned onto a side street and the scent hit me. Bread. Real bread. Crusty. Golden. Warm. I hadn't realized how hungry I still was. My cousin noticed and smirked. "We'll eat soon," he promised, as though reading my mind. He took me to a tenement on the Lower East Side. 5 floors, laundry hanging between the buildings like sails on a crooked ship. The stairwell smelled of cabbage and coal. Inside, the room was small. A bed, a stove, a cracked window with the skyline peeking through. But it was dry and warm and quiet. "This is yours for now," he said, gesturing to a cot in the corner. "You'll find work soon enough." I didn't ask what kind. I knew it didn't matter. That evening, we sat on the rooftop. The city stretched in every direction, an ocean made of bricks and hope. My cousin pointed out landmarks, the Woolworth building, still under construction, the docks, where ships belched smoke and men hauled crates, a church with a bell tower that rang every hour like a heartbeat. He handed me a slice of bread and cheese. It was the best thing I'd tasted in months. "You'll get used to it," he said, chewing. "The noise, the people, even the cold. Just don't look too lost, or you'll get cheated." I nodded, though I felt impossibly lost already. But that night, in the quiet of that cramped room, I didn't cry. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds below. Laughter, footsteps, a baby crying through thin walls. And I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not safety? Not yet. But maybe the seed of it. The next morning, I rose early. My cousin had already gone to work. I put on the cleanest shirt I had and walked the streets alone. At first, I stuck to corners, observed, watched others cross the street, nod at strangers, ask for directions. Eventually, I began to copy them. A man asked me in English if I needed help. I shook my head. A woman sold newspapers on a corner and smiled without asking questions. A group of boys played stickball in an alley and shouted insults that made me laugh even if I didn't know what they meant. I found myself near a church. The doors were open. Inside, candles flickered and wooden pews stretched into the shadows. I sat quietly in the back. A priest noticed me but said nothing. I stayed a long while. Later, I returned to the tenement. My cousin was home, asleep on the cot. His boots were dusty. His face looked older in rest. I realized how much weight he carried, on his back, his shoulders, his silence. He hadn't said it, but I knew now that he'd saved me, not just with a letter, but with the daily grind of belief, of showing up, of pushing forward. The city was merciless. It swallowed the slow and chewed the weak, but it also had room, just barely, for the ones who kept walking. At dinner, he handed me a small envelope. "You write home," he said. I opened it. Inside were coins, stamps, and a paper with an address written in careful letters. I didn't ask where he got it. I just said, "Thank you." That night, I wrote my first letter. I didn't say how close I came to being sent back. I didn't describe the cold floors or the waiting rooms or the smell of the boat. Instead, I wrote, "I am in America now. I saw the buildings. I ate warm bread. I have a bed of my own. I will find work soon. Tell Mama not to worry. I am safe." It wasn't a lie. Not entirely. It was a beginning. I was told to be ready by 5 in the morning. It was still dark outside, the streets damp from last night's rain. The apartment smelled of old smoke and boiled onions, and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's coughing fit. I dressed in silence. My cousin already gone. He worked at the docks, loading and unloading crates like a machine. Today would be my first day. Not at the docks, no. I wasn't strong enough. Instead, I was headed to a garment factory. The directions were scribbled on a crumpled slip of paper in my coat pocket, but the factory was easy to find. Just follow the trail of tired eyes and aching limbs moving through lower Manhattan, weaving around push carts, horse manure, and the smell of yesterday's soup. I didn't need to ask where the sweatshops were. The buildings told you. Narrow, filthy, and always buzzing with the sound of 100 sewing machines humming like angry bees. Inside, the air was thick, not just hot, dense, like breathing through wool. Rows of young girls, many no older than 14, hunched over machines, their eyes glazed from the rhythm. They didn't look up when I entered. The foreman, a stocky man with a thick mustache and an impatient frown, waved me toward an empty table. There were no introductions, no forms to fill out. Just a nod, a spool of thread, and a pile of sleeves that needed to be stitched. I didn't know what I was doing. My hands shook. The needle caught the fabric and jammed. The girl next to me, without speaking, reached over and showed me how to reset it. Her name was Rosa, I think. Or maybe Anna. Names weren't important here. Speed was. Every mistake meant a shout, and every pause meant you were replaceable. We were paid by the piece. A cent or two per finished collar or hem. If you were fast, maybe you'd make $1 by day's end. If not, you simply went hungry. There were no breaks, no lunch, no chatter. The windows were nailed shut. Fire hazard be damned. Some girls had bandages on their fingers, blood soaking through. Some coughed from the lint in the air. others from the exhaustion that came from standing too long, too often, for too little. By midday, I could no longer feel my back. I had no idea what time it was, but the shadows on the floor had shifted. The foreman barked something I didn't catch and stormed toward the door. There had been a mistake in the shipment. Panic spread quietly, like spilled ink. No one stopped sewing, but you could feel the tension. A girl cried softly when her thread snapped for the third time. No one looked at her. When the sun finally dipped and the light outside turned orange, we were allowed to leave. My legs trembled as I walked down the stairwell, past the factory door with its rusty hinges. Outside, the city didn't care. People rushed past. Peddlers yelled in broken English. A boy chased a rat with a stick. The world moved on while we folded into its shadows. I didn't speak a word on the walk home. My hands were red and raw. My shirt was stained with oil. But more than the soreness, it was the silence that clung to me. A silence heavy with questions I couldn't answer. Was this what we had crossed the ocean for? Was this survival, or just another form of imprisonment? When I returned to the apartment, my cousin wasn't home. A cold plate of potatoes waited on the table. I sat beside it, stared at my hands, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would feel like. It was only the first day, and still, somehow, I was grateful. Evening came slowly, not with peace, but with the weight of fatigue. The kind that doesn't announce itself with yawns or drooping eyes, but with a silence that falls heavy on the soul. After my first day in the factory, my legs ached in places I didn't know existed, and my fingers, stiff, scratched, and swollen, trembled as I tried to button my collar. But in the tenement, there was no room for complaint. Everyone was just as broken as I was. The halls were narrow, dimly lit with flickering gas lamps that hissed softly as if whispering secrets to the cracked wallpaper. I passed families gathered around weak fires in shared kitchens, potatoes, cabbage, and a bitter kind of hope boiled in dented tins. Children cried, mothers scolded, old men wheezed into rags. This was life now. Not in a storybook, but in a building that groaned with the weight of its occupants and the mold on its ceilings. My room, if you could call it that, was barely large enough to fit the cot. There were no mattress, just a burlap sack stuffed with rags, and an old wool blanket that smelled of dust and time. I shared the space with two others. One snored already, boots still on. The other, a boy my age, stared at the ceiling, his lips moving in prayer, or maybe in memory of something better. We spoke little. Language was a wall between us, but so was exhaustion. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be explained. We were all immigrants, all outsiders trying to hold ourselves together in a city that didn't care whether we sank or swam, so long as we didn't block traffic. I laid back and stared through the cracked window. Somewhere beyond the alley, a piano played faintly, out of tune, maybe from a saloon. A woman's laughter followed, sharp and bright like a match in a mine. It made me ache more than the labor had. That someone, somewhere, could still laugh like that while we fell apart in this rotwood coffin. I pulled the blanket to my chin. Each breath felt like inhaling another's misery. The scent of mildew, sweat, and burnt coal clung to everything. But I couldn't close the window. The heat inside was unbearable, and besides, the rats preferred closed spaces. We had learned to make peace with the noise. Sirens, street cries, the metallic rhythm of the city clanked like a broken music box. It was our lullaby now. Someone knocked on the door down the hall. loud, angry. A voice followed in a language I didn't understand, followed by the sharp slam of a fist against wood. No one went to open it. Not here. You learned quickly not to answer doors that knocked too hard. I thought I'm home. Not the apartment, not even the ship, but the actual home I had left behind. A sunlit yard, chickens clucking, my mother hanging linen on a line that danced with the breeze. It felt like a dream I wasn't allowed to remember anymore. Here, in this crumbling tomb of labor and longing, memories were dangerous. They softened you, and softness was something you couldn't afford. I turned on my side. The springs in the cot creaked like dying birds. I thought of the next day. More sleeves, more stitches, more scolding, more hunger. Maybe I'd earn enough for a piece of bread. Maybe not. But I'd still go. Because not going meant giving up. And giving up meant drowning in the very sea I had once crossed to survive. Sleep didn't come gently. It never did here. It clawed its way into your bones only after exhaustion cracked your defenses. And even then, it wasn't restful. It was escape. Brief, cruel, necessary escape. As I drifted, I heard my cotmate murmur in his sleep. A word, a name, something from his own country. Maybe he dreamed of someone waiting for him. Maybe he dreamed of silence or a hot meal. Maybe, like me, he dreamed of the life we had imagined. Before Ellis Island, before the needles and foremen and rent collectors. But the city didn't stop for dreams. And morning always came faster than we were ready for. The sun, if it could be called that, barely crept over the rooftops the next morning. It filtered through the soot-streaked glass in narrow, apologetic lines, like it knew it didn't belong here. I blinked awake in the gray half-light, my back sore from the plank bed, my tongue dry with sleep. Another day had begun, though it felt indistinguishable from the last. A slow churn of labor, silence, and hopes stretched thin like threadbare socks. The tenement stirred to life, or something close to it. A shuffle of boots in the hallway, water splashing from a cracked basin, a cough echoing 3 doors down. I moved in a rhythm now, mechanical, muted. Pull on shirt, tighten laces, pocket the ration ticket. But that morning, before heading out, I stopped at the mail slot downstairs. It was just a slit in the wall where, once a day, the city's indifferent hand shoved its notices, bills, and empty promises. I had sent letters. Many. To my brother, to my uncle in Cleveland, who I'd never met, but was rumored to be a foreman at a warehouse. To a friend back home who'd once said, "If you make it to America, write me." I had written them all. Carefully, in my best English, with stamps paid for by skipping meals. And yet, nothing came back. The other tenants did the same. You could tell. They'd pause at the slot, pretending they weren't hoping, pretending they didn't want to find something there. But the silence of the slot was always the same. No letters, no news, no help. I once saw a woman, middle-aged, Polish, I think, cry quietly after checking it. She stood still for nearly a minute, crumpled her apron in her fist, then walked out into the street without saying a word. We all pretended not to see. In this place, we respected each other's disappointments too much to name them. That morning, however, something strange did happen. A single envelope lay on the dust-worn floor near the slot, not addressed to me, not even to our building. Just lost. Dropped maybe by a postman in a hurry, or by fate playing games again. I picked it up. The paper was thin, nearly translucent. The handwriting, delicate. A woman's hand, I thought. I didn't open it, of course, but I held it for longer than I should have, just feeling the weight of it, the possibility of it. A life in that envelope. Someone waiting, someone hoping, someone maybe saying, "Come home." Or "It's been too long." Or "We miss you." It was everything I wanted for myself, trapped in a paper I had no right to read. I left it at the front desk in case its rightful owner came looking, but part of me wished it would vanish, float back to wherever letters go when they aren't delivered, into the pockets of saints or the hands of dreamers. That evening, after another long shift, I sat by the window of the hallway. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows that stretched like arms across the peeling wallpaper. I thought about how we all wait for something. A reply, a sign, a new beginning. How we keep writing letters even when we know they won't be answered, because to stop writing is to admit no one is listening. In that moment, I realized that the cruel genius of Ellis Island wasn't just in its endless inspections or impossible quotas. It was in the way it asked you to believe in a future that you might never see, and then gave you just enough survival to keep believing a little longer. Down the street, someone whistled. A tune I half recognized. It sounded like a lullaby from home, though I couldn't place the words anymore. Strange how things slip away. Languages, names, songs, like sand between your fingers, until all you're left with is the rhythm of missing them. I went to bed without dinner that night, not from lack of food, but from lack of appetite. The soul grows hungry in different ways, and no bread or stew could feed what I lacked. I dreamt of letters, hundreds of them, fluttering down from the sky like snow, each one bearing a name, a voice, a memory. And when I reached out to catch one, just one, it dissolved in my hands like mist. The room was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from a breeze or draft. No, this was a deeper cold. The kind that lived in the walls. The kind that clung to your bones. I'd been called up, finally, for my formal immigration interview. Everyone had to do it eventually. Some passed through in hours. Others, like me, waited days, even weeks. The waiting wore you down, hollowed you out, until you began to feel like paperwork yourself, filed and forgotten. I sat on a narrow wooden bench, hands clenched between my knees. Around me, others waited their turn in silence, eyes flickish toward the heavy door at the end of the hall. That door was like the jaws of a great machine. It swallowed you whole, then spat you out, stamped, denied, delayed. A few came out smiling. More came out with tears in their eyes. One boy, no older than 16, exited trembling and vomited in a corner. They said the questions weren't hard if you had nothing to hide. But they never asked them in the language you knew best, and they never looked you in the eye when they did. My name was called. The clerk was a man with a face like dry leather and a voice that never rose above a murmur. He motioned for me to sit. No welcome, no smile, just the scrape of a chair against the floor and the rustle of papers as he turned them over, like a butcher examining cuts of meat. He began without warning. Name? I gave it, slowly, clearly. Country of origin? I said it. Do you have any relatives here in the United States? Yes, I said. A cousin in Chicago. A lie, but a hopeful one. He asked what I did for work. Whether I'd ever been in prison, whether I had a trade, whether I could read and write. I answered everything truthfully, or as close to the truth as could be useful. But then came the question that always unraveled people. Do you consider yourself likely to become a public charge? I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't know the right answer. What they wanted was certainty. They wanted you to say, "No, sir," with unwavering confidence, as if poverty were something you could choose to avoid just by saying so. But how could I promise that? I had no money, no job, no sponsor. All I had was willpower and a little luck, and both of those were running thin. "I will work," I said. "Anything. I can learn. I am strong." He made a note. Not a nod, not a word. Just ink on paper, sealing some decision I would not see. Then came the morality questions. Had I ever stolen? Had I ever engaged in immoral conduct? Was I married? Was I pregnant? Was I bringing disease? Had I ever been an anarchist, a polygamist, a prostitute, or an idiot? He said the word idiot like it meant something clinical, like it could be detected with a glance. I said no to all. I kept my voice steady, my hands still. But inside, something bent, something folded. Because what they were really asking, all of them, was the same question. Are you worthy of staying? Not do you dream? Not did you cross oceans for a chance? But will you cost us anything? I could see it in the way he looked at me. Not as a person, but as a risk, a probability, a possible failure. When the questions ended, he didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look up. He just stamped the paper and waved for the next. I stepped out of the room and back into the corridor. My legs felt like ash. I didn't know whether I had passed or failed. They didn't tell you right away. Sometimes you found out days later, with a call or a letter or a knock on the dormitory door. Back in the waiting hall, the boy who had vomited was still there. Someone had given him a cloth and a sip of water. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and though neither of us spoke, we both understood. We were not alone in this. Outside, the air had shifted. A fog was creeping in off the harbor, curling around the docks like fingers. The Statue of Liberty stood out there still, torch raised high, but in that moment, she seemed more distant than ever. That night, I wrote another letter, this time to no one in particular, just to myself maybe. I wrote that I had faced the questions, that I had not broken, that I still believed I could belong here, even if the system disagreed. I folded the letter and tucked it under my pillow, a prayer in paper. And as I lay down, I whispered one more truth, too soft for anyone to hear. I am more than what they see. There was no trumpet fanfare, no grand announcement, just a quiet knock on the dormitory door at dawn. A shadow moved across the floorboards as I stirred from a restless sleep. I opened my eyes to see a young officer standing at the threshold, papers clutched in hand, cap too large for his head. He looked barely older than I was, and yet, in that moment, he held my future in his fingers. "You're cleared," he said flatly. "You may proceed to the mainland." I stared at him for a beat too long. The words had landed like foreign currency, valuable, but strange in my hands. I sat up slowly, blinking away the fog of broken dreams and stiff limbs. For a second, I almost asked him to repeat it, but he had already turned, moving on to the next name, the next story, the next soul hanging in the balance. Cleared. That single word cracked open the walls of my reality. I felt the tears before I even realized they were mine. Quiet, thin streaks down tired cheeks. No sobs, no drama. Just the silent release of a breath I'd been holding since the boat first pulled away from Europe. I gathered what little I owned, A small satchel, a coat that didn't fit, a pair of shoes with soles thinning like paper. Every object I carried had been touched by fear, soaked in hope, handled with care because they were all I had. But today, they would walk with me into a new chapter. The Great Hall was buzzing now. Others, too, had received their verdicts. Some packed with joy. Others wept beside their cots. A few sat silently, staring at nothing. You could tell who had been accepted. It wasn't just the papers in their hands. It was the way they stood. A little taller, a little straighter, like the weight of the world had shifted ever so slightly off their shoulders. I stepped out into the yard where the ferry waited. The sky above was a flat, endless gray. Seagulls cried overhead, slicing through the morning air like messengers of fate. The ferry bobbed in place, iron and smoke, a bridge to the unknown. As I waited in line to board, I glanced back one last time at the red brick building that had swallowed me whole only days ago. It was strange how something so imposing, so terrifying, could become familiar. I had hated those walls, feared them, and yet I found myself whispering a silent thank you, not because they were kind, but because I had made it through. The boat horn echoed across the harbor, long and low, like the sigh of some great beast awakening. I found a spot near the railing, clutching it with both hands as the vessel began to churn forward. The water parted beneath us, a restless, foamy trail in our wake. And then I saw her, the Statue of Liberty. She stood tall and still, torch raised high, staring out over the bay like a sentinel made of dreams. I had seen her before, from the ship, a distant promise. But now she was something else entirely. A witness, a test, a question. Now that you're here, what will you do? Around me, others cried out. Some cheered, others whispered prayers in languages I didn't know. A boy beside me crossed himself. A woman clutched her baby tighter. I looked at her, the statue, and didn't feel triumph. I felt responsibility, because getting here wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The real struggle, the job hunting, the rent scraping, the nights without sleep or bread, that was still ahead. America didn't promise ease. It promised a chance, and even that wasn't guaranteed. But for now, I let myself feel it. The sheer overwhelming relief of motion, of forwardness, of having escaped something, even if I didn't know what came next. The cold wind lashed at my coat and burned my cheeks, but I didn't turn away. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded letter I'd written the night before. The one where I reminded myself I was more than what they saw. I wasn't just a name on a form or a question in a ledger. I was flesh. I was fear. I was fire. The ferry carried us toward Manhattan, where jagged rooftops pierced the mist like teeth. Somewhere in that chaos, my life would begin again. I would find a bed, a job, maybe even a friend. I would try not to disappear. And maybe, years from now, I would tell someone this story, not with bitterness, but with the quiet grace of someone who remembers being tested and survived. I would leave out the worst parts. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I would start the story like this. I came through Ellis Island once, a long time ago, and let me tell you, it wasn't the boat ride or the waiting that nearly broke me. It was the moment I realized that survival wasn't a place you arrive at. It's something you earn every single day.